Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Generational Archives on this beautiful, beautiful sunny day. But perhaps it might not be sunny when you listen, but I hope if it's not, their sun is in your heart. So, this is Dr. Raina J. León. I'm your scholar, your creative, the daughter in the mother daughter duo of Generational Archives. Mommy, how are you going to introduce yourself today?
Well, I'm the mother in the mother-daughter duo.
Yeah, that's true. And also the hardcore driver. We're going to talk about some updates in our discoveries, our generational research. But the hardcore driver, we went down to South Carolina just recently, and she wouldn't let me touch the wheel, y'all. She wouldn't let me touch the wheel. But if you are listening for the first time to this podcast, Generational Archives, it is the show where we connect, heal, uncover through intergenerational conversations and archival research. So we're trying to find our people and share our methods with you along the way. So one of our practices that we have begun is using a check-in question to start this podcast. And this one is, a pretty easy one. Are you a morning person or an evening person, Mommy?
I am definitely a morning person. I get up very early. I can run all day. And then there's a point that I will sit, turn on the TV, and I don't see much of it because the TV puts me to sleep. So I am I woke up this morning at 5 o'clock, didn't have to get up, but was pretty much up at 5 o'clock this morning.
I am not a morning person. I have never been a morning person. I don't know how morning people function in the world. I prefer to be going to sleep at around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And in my most joyous and natural rhythms, I wake up around 10 or 11 or 12. And then I leisurely start my day. I don't talk to people. I have to have coffee. I got to have the shower. I got to ease into my day. And then I'm a very happy Reina. And
Your brother is a morning person.
yeah, Tito is absolutely a morning person. He's at like 3 a.m. in the morning, bright and early, ready to go.
He's at work sometimes by 5:30.
Yeah, I don't know how you all exist. Now I can do mornings if I have to, and I do actually really like mornings when I'm Mateo and I, my husband and I, we are going back and forth and who gets the kids ready in the morning, who's the first contact, because they are early risers. And when it's my turn, I grumble a little bit, but there is something beautiful about seeing them kind of opening into their excitement and joy for the day. So that shifts my mode. But y'all, nah, mornings, they can miss me. But unfortunately, that's not how the work world works. And as a teacher, when I lived in Vegas, the school day started at 7. And the kids all the time would be like, yo, Miss León, because I was Miss León at the time, how is it that you're so happy? Because I was really happy to see them. I was very excited. And I was like, if it wasn't for you, I would not be happy. I would be a very mean person. But I'm so happy to see you this morning. So I feel like my day is starting right. So I think it's situational too. The reason I ask that question though is because there are things that the records will never tell you that have to come from recollection or story, and maybe that actually might be important too. So was grandmama a morning person? Was grandpa? Mommy, do you remember?
Yeah, they were definitely morning people.
Mm.
Absolutely morning people.
And so I'm interested too in like how that passes from one generation to the other. Obviously, I'm an aberration in my family. So where are my night people? Where are my night owls in the family? I'm strange. And I kind of like that too. So, maybe you all want to ask about your people of were they morning people? Were they night owls? Were they early birds? And see if that connects with you. So let's transition into our updates. So the last time we recorded, or one of the previous episodes, I should say, was about Lockhart Baptist Church. And we got the idea of going down to Lockhart Baptist Church during Easter Sunday because we had tried calling, and it's a very small church. Folks were in their working lives. We visited before, gone to the cemetery, but the church had remained closed because we had gone during the working days. And when we last went, we weren't able to stay over a Sunday. So this time I had the idea to go down for Easter service. And I was like, if anybody's going to be at that church, they're going to be there for Easter service. So we got in the car and we drove. After our spring break with my kids, we all went to the beach. And then my husband and father took the kids back to Philly so that they could go to school. And Mommy, you and I, we went down to Richmond and saw our Aunt Renee and there before we headed down to South Carolina to Columbia. And had some great adventures along the way, including some wonderful stops with good friends in Durham. But with Lockhart Baptist Church, along the way, we called Mr. Logan, Anthony Logan, who was the funeral director of the Logan Funeral Home that we've mentioned in a previous episode. And we're like, so who would we talk to find this information of when is the service? I thought it might be around 9. And Mommy said maybe around 11. And Mr. Logan was like, nah, if you get there around 9 or 11, folks will already be home taking off their church clothes and getting ready for the day. So, no, you got to get there earlier. And he gave us the phone number to Reverend Abney, one of the reverends within the community. And so we called, we texted, and Reverend Abney texted me back and said, y'all, it's
6:45.
6:45.
We were in
sunrise service.
Columbia, South Carolina, which is about an hour away from Saluda, which meant we got out about 5 o'clock.
That's
to
right.
Get over to the church.
So all of a sudden, we were both morning people again, and we're cutting through the mist and the night
fog.
and the fog to get to Lockhart Baptist Church. And I have to tell you, there's this one moment when I think it was one of the deacons who was coming out, just walking to church, right? But it's dark, and we're the car is right next to the cemetery, and I'm like, oh no, this is the beginning of a zombie movie. It's got a different meaning to Resurrection Sunday. Oh no. But he was just coming out with walking up the road with his Bible in hand, ready to go to church, and my sci-fi mind goes way afield. And then I was like, Raina, let's come back to reality. So but we had this wonderful warm welcome at Lockhart Baptist Church, a beautiful sermon and service, and lots of singing and lots of guiding throughout, and wonderful welcome. We were able to participate in the breakfast afterwards, and we got to meet three people who actually knew our relatives, including my great-great-grandmother, who was a mother of my Nana Sarah, who is in the previous episode, as a child. So we're looking forward to interviewing that deacon. And anything else we should note about that visit to Lockhart Baptist Church?
Well, we saw the stained glass windows that had their names on them.
Yeah.
And we're a little saddened because my cousin Anthony had said that most of the Logans were gone.
Right.
So clearly there weren't many relatives left at the church, and even most of the people there did not know the church history. So it was several of the older people, much older people, that we were directed to get the church history, who knew the family. So it was good in that respect to see and meet those individuals, but a little sad that a lot of the family has left the area.
And at the same time, again, the other side is that our relatives had their names inscribed in stained glass. So this idea of returning to the church and being able to have that connection with them, the foresight of our ancestors too, in creating this marker of their connection to this church. And I wanted to walk around and revisit some of our our ancestors, and we came right after a very long rain. And so Mommy was like, "No,
we are not going in the cemetery.
Can't go in the cemetery today.
Buried ourselves in mud.
Right. You might be falling into the grave there, so you got to leave that one alone." So we know we will return many, many times. And I just want to offer some Thanksgiving too for the Lockhart Baptist Church community, for that welcome, for that connection. And we're really looking forward to building in it. So there's another update.
Well, they
Mommy.
also recognized us as the descendants of Harry Logan.
Yes.
So instead of asking for visitors who were at the
Yes.
church, they said, are the descendants of Harry Logan here? And
Yes.
so we were able to be recognized as the descendants
Yes.
of one of the founders of the church. So an update. And looking at some information on my step-grandfather, my grandmother's second husband, Willard Croston, a census record came up. And I have to say, in the past, when I was doing research, I didn't pay attention to census records. I said, oh, what are they going to tell me? They're just going to tell me that somebody lived in a particular area. So this census record came up, and one of their children was listed. And the child was my mother, and she was listed as Esther Croston. And I never knew my mother ever lived with them at all. And so this was the 1950 census in Washington, D.C. My mother, we talked about before, always had her birth year wrong. She thought she was a year younger than what she was, but all the records indicate that she was born in 1932 and not 1933. So the census record had her as 17 versus 18. My mother had my older sister at 18. So in talking to my sister when we went down to Richmond, I said, it looks like they sent her to D.C. My sister says she was born in New York, so maybe they sent her later to her father. But it was just interesting to find this record. So now we know that my mother is listed as Alhara Satterwhite. She's listed as Queen Esther Nicholson. She's listed now as Esther Croston. And she's under her married name of Queen Esther Thomas. So if you're looking for records for your relatives, you got to know some stories in order to be able to find them in all their different permutations and names.
Well, and thinking about one record can reveal so much. So another feature of this trip to South Carolina was that you had mentioned in conversation with some of our cousins, oh, where did grandmom, and in your case, mommy, grow up? And you had remembered part of the name of the street, but I was able to find the death record of her uncle who raised her. And in that record, it was listed where he had lived at the time, and that was where she grew up. So we were able, by looking at a death record, to determine the location, the address of where grandmom had grown up. Now, when we went, and as our cousins had said, that house is long gone, torn down, and bought by the church next door. But we were able to go there and see the area where she had grown up.
Yeah, so it says how paying attention to all this information is so important. Census records are important, death certificates, but no, they may send you down another journey with another story.
Well, and census records not only tell you the relationships of people and their ages, it also tells you where people were born. Generally, it's just the state, but sometimes it's actually noted the city. It'll tell you whether people can read or not. It'll tell you all sorts of different information. Their occupations, all sorts of information is noted in that census. And in the census where I looked for more information about where grandmom had grown up, it also listed the street names too. So that was a confirmation of address as well. When we were talking to my Aunt Renee, she had shared that the street name had changed. And when I looked at the census, I noted that, right? The street before was called Langier, and then it changed over time to something else. And it was through conversation with my Aunt Renee that both of those pieces of information were confirmed, and the census was given context for those different names. So I think we're going to transition, right?
We're going to transition, and keeping with going backwards and trying to capture the stories of your relatives, I decided we've talked about my grandmother on both sides, and now we're going to talk about my grandfather from Uniontown, my dad's father. So I'm going to give a little blurb about what I wrote about him. Ask Raina what she remembered, because she just told me something that I don't even remember. So Albert James Thomas was born in 1906 and died in 1994. We called him Picky. I don't know the origin of that name. I guess I need to ask somebody, but he was never grandfather, grandpa. He was Picky. He had this disgusting habit of chewing tobacco. So he would spit the tobacco in the cans that were all around the seat where he sat. Ugh. He once said that he was supposed to be dead, according to the doctor. So I don't know what he had, but he also said he always told us that all those doctors were dead. So he was still there. He was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and married to my grandmother, Alberta, for over 65 years. Although they separated several times, they always stayed married. They argued all the time. So much so that when anyone in the family is arguing now, we say, "You sound just like Picky and Granny." I know my sister-in-law and brother will say that. I'll be laughing, and they'll say, "I know. We sound like Picky and Granny." I would have said that he cursed a lot, but the phrase he actually used all the time was "what the Sam Hill" instead of "what the F." So I don't know who Sam Hill was. I don't know what that refers to. His father was Walter Thomas and his mother was Julia Granger, and they had 7 children. The sibling order was my Aunt Ruth, who eventually went to Harrisburg, my Uncle Clarence, who was blind, my grandfather, my Aunt Susan, who lived in New York and was a nurse, my Uncle Russell, we called him Uncle Rock. He was a bookie loan shark. My Uncle Walter, who everybody called Uncle Bertie, who lived in New York, my Aunt Marjorie, Margie, who I never knew existed, actually, until I looked at the tombstone of my great-grandparents and realized she was listed.
Yeah.
She died in that TB outbreak that took many lives in the area in 1947. As stated in another episode talking about my dad, my grandfather was a hard worker. He worked at the Crane Company in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, where my dad worked for a number of years. He left Uniontown on Sunday and came back on Friday, and then worked at Trucio's coal yard on the weekend. He also helped build my dad's house and built his house. The original house, I believe, was down over the hill in the woods and was built with some of the bricks from the original homestead of Jacob Thomas. I happen to remember that today. And as an aside, the red bricks in front of my dad's house were also supposedly from that homestead. I wish we had saved some of them when that house was torn down. I have to ask my brother or uncle if they remember that location of that house in the woods. My grandfather was always described as stubborn. He was a complicated person. Some of that history I will leave for another time, but know that all of us have positives and negatives in our history. This stubbornness description was so pervasive that when it was obvious to me that he had dementia, my father thought he was just being stubborn. For example, one time the heat went out in the house and he didn't call my dad, who lived across the street. I tried to tell my dad that he doesn't know how to use a telephone anymore. My dad said he's just being stubborn. They realized that something was wrong, however, when he tried to fry something with dishwashing liquid, and he burned himself in the process. They also discovered one day that he had fallen, hit himself on a shovel, injured himself pretty badly, but didn't realize it, and he wouldn't go to the hospital. My dad called me on the phone saying, "I don't know what to do," and I said, "Just call the medical people. He's not going to listen to you, his son. But if they come and tell him he has to go to the hospital, maybe he will go." So he did go. He didn't even realize that his beloved dog had died. They discovered his dog, Teddy, and my brother had to go and bury him. And all my grandfather kept saying is, "Teddy's not dead." He had had a stroke earlier and was briefly in rehab, but was able to return home. But this last time, He got better in the hospital, was able to go to a nursing home, and he only lived for 2 days. I always said that was the stubbornness, that he wasn't going to be placed in a nursing home, and rather than be there, he died. My dad, when he died, talked about how supportive he had been and that he wasn't sure how he was going to make it without his support. Daddy also described that Picky was really hard on my uncle Jim Pete, but I never heard my uncle express those sentiments. When my sister and I were coming to the funeral, my dad called from the funeral home and said there were not many flowers there. So Faith and I called and ordered a whole bunch of flowers from the White Swan, which was the big florist shop at the time. However, by the time we got to the funeral home, the place was filled. And my dad just smiled and said, well, they weren't there earlier. Faith and I took our flowers back home so we could enjoy them for a little while. This gave me a clue as to what my father would want for his homegoing service. I remember when we made arrangements for my mother, Daddy telling the funeral director that everything had to be top of the line. So when he died and I had to make those funeral arrangements, all I kept saying to Miss Muriel was, I don't want to spend all this money, but for my dad, he would want top of the line. So this is what we're doing. Yeah, all the flowers, all the sprays, all the everything. This is what he would want. So my grandfather is buried in the Thomas Cemetery next to my grandmother and all the many others of my family. And I thought maybe I would get there for Memorial Day this year, but it doesn't look like it. In fact, I have a trip planned for Vegas. So I don't think I'm going to make it this year. Maybe I'll go earlier and do our tradition of cleaning off the graves. So anything you remember, Raina, because you spoke specifically about...
Yeah, I was just recounting how anytime that we went to Uniontown before Piggy transitioned, we would always go over to his house and kind of grumble about it because this was the obligatory visit to our great-grandfather, but he was literally across the street from our grandfather where we were also staying whenever we visited. But we would go and we would sit, and when Piggy and Granny were alive, it would be both of them together, and they would nitpick at one another, and you would ask them about how they were, and then there would be every now and then like some pieces of their different life stories, especially Piggy's, as I recall. But Granny also talked about her life before that moment, but we never recorded anything, and I don't think that Dito or I really were paying attention. I know I wasn't. And now that I think back to this work, I'm like, oh, those probably should have been recorded too. Even just the commentary about the day would have opened up to other things. But I do remember one specific instance of hanging out over there and Picky teaching me how to make the bridge of cards. And it was actually pretty close to when he transitioned, because I remember when he died, spending a whole summer working on that skill, and I can do
because they had card parties all the time, and they play cards. And one thing they did, which I never understood, they'd play cards, and then all of them, my aunts, all of my dad, all of them, they'd sit there and fight over these card games. And they also went camping together all the time. And they fight the whole time at the camp. And I would say, why do you do this? This is supposed to be a vacation or something. They always traveled together and played cards, but they would always argue. And then they would, somebody would get up and they would say, Norma, you want to sit down? You've been watching this all this time. And I would be like, oh, hell no. I want to love y'all because you all fight too much. No, I'm not sitting down. Yes, I've seen you play. No, I'm not doing this. And they played Bidwest was their game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember being taught some of these rules. I remember how to do the bridge. I don't remember the rules of Bidwest for sure, but that was a part of this skill. I want to note that you all may be hearing some bells in the background, and that is my dog, Phoenix, which I think is poignant because Phoenix is the Spanish word for phoenix, the bird that rises from the ashes. And we're talking about our ancestors. So, maybe let's just take this as the ancestors chiming into the conversation, or not, but I'm going to make it poetic. So that's what I do. So where should we go from here, Mommy?
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of the story of progression in terms of my family going backwards. We hope soon to get my husband so that he can talk about your grandfather, his father, and get more of that rich story, because that's a rich story.
Well, and we are already conceiving of the next season, and that season will incorporate some guests. So this trip down to South Carolina has already availed us those stops along the way. It was very clear that there were so many people that are holders of memory and would be wonderful guests to talk about what they do in connection with archival research or holding space for ancestral connection or using ancestral stories and family stories to be oracles into connection with other people and connecting with scholarly contributions. There's so much to be shared, whether it is just in memory or in how to take memory and transfer it into the creation of something new. So look out for some great news to come with the guests that we'll be having in the future. And we're also talking about creating some gifts for you all, I suppose, in sharing some of these historical documents and resources in visual form. So we were just looking at a piece from a short film of my Aunt Doris, who's in one of the earlier episodes, and pulling out a piece of her dancing in this short from the 1930s. So including that as an archive to share with you all. So lots to come, and I hope that you continue to listen. And as you do, if you like what you're listening to, you can support us on Patreon by looking at Generational Archives. You can like and subscribe and share the news with other people. And you can also, in the comments on YouTube or your preferred space for hearing podcasts, whether it's a website specifically or Spotify or Apple or iHeartRadio or Audible, we're on all the things. Wherever it is that you listen, comment. Note what you like, what you're interested in learning more about, and we will definitely respond to that wherever we see it. So thank you so much for listening, as always.
And again, I want to say thank you. We've enjoyed the ride. Hope you continue with us, and we will we'll hear you, or you'll hear us once again next week.
Thanks, y'all.